Okay, so today is going to be actually a very short introduction to Simone Weil because she's not difficult to decipher. In fact, I don't even need to go into big explanations of her philosophy because it's quite simple to read. So unlike Maimonides and even Rumi and all of the ones we've studied needed some kind of introduction to really access, right? The text Simone Weil is pretty self-explanatory. It's my gift to you after a lot of, sweating intellectually over these difficult texts. We end with a kind of on a relaxing note. So I'll basically tell you a bit of her bio. That's what's interesting about her. And then I'll just compare her briefly with Levinas and we'll be done. So let me write, we don't even need an outline. I'll just start straight up with the bio. Okay, so she was born in 1909. And when did she die? 1943. So, okay, so she died very young, and we'll see why in a second. So she was born in Paris also. So all of the philosophers we've been studying were in Paris. So you kind of did a study abroad. We went to Paris for the last couple of weeks. And she was born also to Jewish parents, but agnostic, right? Levinas was born also in a Jewish context, and they were more religious. Her parents have absolutely no connection to Judaism. And this shows in her own attitude towards Judaism. It's interesting that she's somebody who has pretty much explored every single worldview, every single religion except Judaism, right? Some people have called it Simone Weil's blind spot, right? So she really has no clue and not even any interest, sadly, in her own tradition, right? She was born in good circumstances. They were part of the elites of France, of Paris. Her father was a doctor. Her brother was a mathematician. She herself was pretty smart. Also, she was fluent in Greek by age 12, and then she started to teach herself Sanskrit, which is the holy language of Hinduism, because she was actually interested in the Bhagavad Gita, right? I'll talk more about that in a second. Let me write it down, Bhagavad Gita. So we didn't talk too much about Eastern religions in this class, but I'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow, because she draws upon some of the concepts found in Eastern traditions. It was a huge truck. Did you hear it? Okay. So, yeah. So anyways, she actually studied Hinduism. She studied Taoism, which we'll talk about tomorrow also, Taoism. And the main work there is the Tao Te Ching. And I would suggest for tomorrow, I would really suggest in preparation that you read through the Tao Te Ching. It's not very long, it's a few poems. And you can read it in a half hour, less if you read quickly. And this will give you an idea, and I'm going to really develop some of the concepts there tomorrow, because she's drawing on the Tao Te Ching, which was written in China by an author called Lao Tse, which actually means, I found out, the old guy. So nothing mysterious about the name. So she believed that all religions share a common core, that if you dig enough in one particular religion, you will get to the truth, no matter what the religion is. So even if you start from very different sides of the spectrum, if you start with the monotheistic religions and you start here at the other end with the Hinduism, for instance, and you dig deep enough, you will get to the same place, according to Simone Weil. And I think she has, it's actually, you can argue that, right? When you dig very deeply in each faith, you shed what is not necessary, what is not essential, and you come to a common place, right? So she believed that, and we'll see how that affected her own relationship with Christianity. We'll see that later on she converts to Christianity. But for now, right, this is just her intellectual journey. So she went to a very prestigious high school, not that it matters, but she studied under a very famous philosopher in France that none of you know, called Alain. And he's not translated, so it's pointless to bring him up. But he is an amazing thinker who wrote on Spinoza. That was his specialty. And so she studied with this great mind, right? And then she took the exam to teach philosophy and came out of the exam first in her class. So she was pretty brilliant. She even beat, so in her class, actually, just for the gossip, was also the feminist thinker Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she wrote The Second Sex, very central work in feminist philosophy. She was in the same class as Simone de Beauvoir, and she beat her. She was actually sharper, right, than Simone de Beauvoir. Actually shows in the writing, right? Simone Weil, to be honest, she's not as analytic as Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir is extreme, has a good analytic mind, but Simone Weil goes deeper when it comes to reflecting on the human experience. I think Simone Weil is able to access deeper layers than Simone de Beauvoir, who is an excellent observant. She observes very well reality, but I don't think she goes deep enough. Anyways, it's just my opinion. No consequence here for what's her name? Simone Weil. Okay, so she finishes so she passes the exam to teach. She ends up teaching philosophy in the high school. And then she turns. She has a radical political turn, which we'll talk about. But before we get to that turn, I want to show you how she was also, so not only was she an intellectual, she was also an activist. So her activism all started, so now we're in the second part, her activism. Activism started when she was already 6 years old, right? This was in 1915. Remember, it was World War I. And the French were involved in that war. And when she learned that the soldiers at the front had no access to sugar, she went on a sugar strike, right? She told her parents, I'm not eating sugar anymore, out of, solidarity with our troops, right? She's 6 years old. So then she continues at 9 years old. She's sitting at the dinner table with her parents. And you have to measure how shocking what she says to them. Imagine, well, I'll just say what she said and then I'll explain it. So she announces to them at 9 years old that she has become a Bolshevik. Okay, I will explain. I'll spell it out. A Bolshevik is someone who is part of the revolution, the socialist or Marxist revolution, right? So this is the equivalent of, I don't know, a conservative Republican family, and then their child blurts out at the dinner table at 9 years old that they want to be an anarchist. Or what's this Antifa, right? This movement, right? The left wing right now that is being, that is under scrutiny, right? She said, I want to be part of the anti-fascist left-wing movement, right? So that's kind of crazy, right? Her parents kind of, went along, but she continued. They thought she would grow out of it. No, she continues when she's in her early 20s. So she's already started teaching, right, in the high school, but she takes a leave of absence and she goes and works in a car factory, right? Because she wants to feel closer to the working class, right? Remember, she grew up in the elites, right? She grew up very wealthy, so she's not connected, but she wants to know how is life in the working class, she wants to taste and undergo the same suffering so she can respond to it, right? So she, out of empathy, she decides, I'm gonna go and do a working class job, which is absolutely unfitted to her, right? Actually, in your book, the picture you have in the book, that I don't have the book here, but she's dressed in this kind of overalls. That's the uniform of the car factory, right? So she works there for a bit and she's kind of the oddball there, obviously, because, in her free time, instead of smoking a cigarette, she's reading the Bhagavad Gita, right? And then she's trying to share her findings with her coworkers who have no clue what she's talking about. But anyways, after a while, she gets sick. So she has to stop. She is too much, right? The work is too much for her, obviously. And she has to stop. But she continues in 1936, a few years later. She joins the Spanish Civil War. If you remember, that civil war was the war of the socialist versus the fascist government, right? There was a fascist government got set into place, a dictatorship, right? And there was a movement of resistance, a left-wing movement of resistance, which actually a number of Americans joined, right? Writers like Hemingway joined this war to fight on the left-wing side, and she joins them, right? But she's so clumsy with a gun that she actually makes everybody feel unsafe around her, right? They're afraid she might shoot them accidentally, so they beg her to go. They say, please, we will be better off if you go. We are afraid of your clumsiness. You don't know how to use a gun. One day you will shoot one of us, right? So she leaves. And eventually in 1942, this time now France is under Nazi occupation, and there's a puppet government in France, which is under the Nazi power, but there's a movement of the resistance moved to England, and she wants to join them. She does, but then again, she gets very sick under the pressures and the stress. And this time, sadly, this is a tragic conclusion to an otherwise somewhat humorous life. She dies, right, of tuberculosis, right? So very short life, but very intense life, right? This is someone who really lived her ideals. She's not just philosophizing in an ivory tower. She's trying to live her ideals, and her writing have a dimension of depth, right? Her writings really come from her own substance. This is what makes her so powerful, right? When you read Simone Weil, it's not just concepts. You can sense the lived experience. You can sense that she's weaving these thoughts from her own substance, right? It's very authentic, it's very personal, very intimate, the things that she writes, right? So anyways, last aspect of her life. So we saw the intellectual, we saw the activist. I'm going to write these down. These are the three faces of Simone Weil, right? The intellectual, the activist, and now we will see the mystic, right? She also had religious experience, even though she was raised agnostic. So she actually was visiting Portugal in 1935. So this is maybe 7 years before she dies. And she's visiting a small village in Portugal. And one morning she takes a walk, and she sees a group of villagers gathered for an outside religious service. Very simple, right? The villagers are very simple. It's a few old people, right? And they're just singing. And it's just such a beautiful setting, and very simple, very natural, and she's moved, right, by what she sees, and this begins her journey towards Christianity, right? She has a number of other experiences which confirm to her that this is the path for her. One of them is reading a poem, right? There's a very famous, which you can look up if you want. This is a poem by George Herbert, and it's called Love. So you can read it if you want. And so she reads this poem and feels like the poem is written for her or meant for her. And the last of her experiences in a small church in Italy, in the city of Assisi, right? Which is where also the saint, what's his name? Somebody help me, Catholics in the room.
St. Francis.
Thank you. St. Francis of Assisi, right? This is the same, this is his region. Okay, so she's clearly attracted to Catholicism, and she has a mentor. And in the book that we're reading, there are letters also, right, between her and her mentor. And if you read the letters, you will see that she never actually takes the final step to join the Catholic Church. She never gets baptized. Right, and you can sense the mentor, the priest she's working with, trying to gently, woo her into performing this ritual. And she says, no, and the reason she gives for not joining the church is, she says, I love the world too much, right? To join the church is to leave behind the world. And Simone Weil says, no, I love the world too much. I am part of the world. I feel solidarity with the world. I cannot leave the world behind. I'm going to stay here. And therefore, I cannot be baptized, right? So she refuses the baptism. So she's always kind of a Catholic in exile. And in fact, the way she thinks, although she draws on the Catholic concepts, it is to deeply transform them. So make sure you write this down, because otherwise you will misunderstand what she's doing. She's drawing certainly on Catholic concepts, so she's sounding religious, right? And some of us, right, who read might be immediately turned off, especially if you had a terrible education in Catholic schools, right? So she draws on the concepts, but only to transform them, right? So she's actually going to rework, reimagine these concepts. And that's what makes her very interesting, because she really reimagines what it means to be Catholic in a way that's very powerful and interesting. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, so a few words about her thought, her thinking, and I'll compare her to Levinas. So two main things. where she actually differs from Levinas. So first thing, remember, we saw with Levinas, I'm going to put it in the chat, with Levinas, actually, never mind, I'll just say it. Okay, so remember for Levinas, he's trying to respond to the question, where was God, right? We talked about this. And let's review. Where did Levinas find God, ultimately? Anybody remember? Yes, very good, Kestenbaum, right? Other people, right? Every human being, especially the human being in need, is carrying the trace of God, or is channeling the command of God, right? When you see the imperative in someone's eyes for help, right? The plea or the imperative, and you feel moved to respond, you're responding to the trace of God. You're responding to a command which transcends all your agendas, right? So Levinas situated God in the other human being, right? Simone Weil is going to answer the same question, but differently. She's going to say, no, God is in us. If there was no God during the Holocaust, because none of us acted in a godly way, right? Let me say that again. So for Simone Weil, if there was no God during the Holocaust, it's simply because none of us acted in a godly way. None of us were channeling the divine love. We just remained silent, we remained passive, we remained indifferent, and so God could not flow through us to help these people, right? In many ways, according to Simone Weil, we are, and this is a Christian idea, we are the hands and feet and eyes of God, right? So if we do nothing, in a way, God's hands are tied, right? So she's really following the Christian idea that we are the representatives or the embodiment of God on earth, and if we fail, God cannot act, because God necessarily acts through us. He doesn't act by himself, right? He acts through the human agents. And if the human agents are not open to the divine influence, then God can do nothing. So she situates it's interesting the way she talks about it, because she compares us to priests, right? So she's going, what Simone Weil is going to do is very interesting. She's going to look at the Catholic Mass. Let me write this down, right? The Mass is simply the ceremony you can see if you go to a church, right? The ceremony of worship, right? That you will witness if you enter a Catholic church Sunday morning. You will see the priest and the table, and there will be some singing, preaching, and the priest will offer the bread, right? Or what do you call that? Always forget, the round bread.
A host.
The host, thank you. Right, so the host, which is a small round wafer, which symbolizes the body of Jesus, right? So you have all this very complex ritual. That's the Mass, okay? Now, the Mass normally normally in Catholicism is reserved for the Catholics, right? If you're not Catholic, you cannot be part of this. You can watch from the back, but you can't take the host, you can't do anything. Simone Weil is going to do something very powerful. She's going to transplant the Mass into the streets, right? We'll see how she does that, right? But she's going to really make Catholicism something that all of us as human beings should be doing, right? Kind of, so we'll more on that later. But in general, right, she's going to compare us to priests, and we're going to see how she does that tomorrow. Second point where she this time differs from Levinas is with regards to the personal relationship with God, right? Now, what did Levinas think about a personal relationship with God? What do you remember from what I told you? No answer. In other words, for Levinas, was it still something that he felt attracted to have just a vertical relationship with God? Is this where he found God in silent communion by himself? Where does Levinas find God?
No, he looks more towards horizontal relationship with God, where they're I guess not necessarily equal footing, but it's not the idea of being comforted by God in the same way that it was understood in the vertical relationship, like the parenting. That's kind of which I'm curious about, because is it saying that we become the parents to God, and if that's the case, is that necessarily a horizontal relationship, or is that kind of turning the vertical relationship inverted?
Yeah, it's inverted in Levinas. We become the parents of God. We become, more specifically, the guardians of the divine presence, right? So we are supposed to be protecting the trace of God in other human beings. So yeah, he flips it, right? It's very interesting. Nietzsche would be intrigued, I think, right, from what Levinas is doing. So for Levinas, right, he rejects ultimately, right, this possibility of a vertical relationship with God, even though he briefly mentions it when he talks about the seduction, right, the God as seductor, but then he will never talk about that again. So Simone Weil is the opposite, right? She's going to say, no, we can still have a connection, but the reason why so many of us don't, right? And it's true. A lot of us, right, we try, we want to, we long for, and still no answer, silence, just nothing happens. We feel nothing, right? So a lot of us go through this. And Simone Weil is going to argue that it's not because God is not speaking, it's because we are not on the same wavelength, right? In other words, we are not on the same frequency, and therefore we can't sense, we can't hear. Very much like when you're in your car and you turn the dial of your radio. When you're not yet at the station, you feel a lot of static. And then when you turn just right, you have, boom, the music, right? So she's saying we need to learn to turn the dial spiritually so that we don't hear just static, so that we can actually, poof, connect, right? So she's talking about the necessity of having the correct attitude or stance. And once we reach that, we will begin to connect. Now, we saw this before with Maimonides and Rumi, right? Both talk about cleansing, right? The vessel. Maimonides talks about cleansing the vessel of the mind. Rumi talks about cleansing the vessel of the heart. So that's also a kind of alignment, right? Many philosophers understand that, and a certain alignment is needed. You have to attune yourself. You have to cleanse yourself if there is going to be a connection. God is not going to blast through your life with a loudspeaker, right? So there is a preparation that is needed, right? We saw that with Maimonides, with Rumi, and now here with Simone Weil. Now, for this preparation, this is interesting. Simone Weil is going to draw on the Chinese concept of action without action. Okay, so this is a paradox. I want you to Google it in preparation for tomorrow, but this is in essence a way of acting which is not an action, right? So I'm not going to say anything right now, but I'm going to let you do the research, and tomorrow I'll ask you about it. I'll be like, okay, so what is it? What have you found, right? So I'm going to let you study this notion of action without action, or passive activity, right? Any one of these is the same, right? And this is one of the central concepts of the Tao Te Ching, right? So make sure you read the Tao Te Ching, make sure you maybe Google some of these notions. And so she's going to say, we need to adopt this attitude of action without action. If we're going, so what she's basically saying is that Taoism has stumbled upon a truth which is fundamental to Christianity, right? She's saying that, in other words, we need to learn from them in order to properly attune ourselves as Christians to the divine, right? They have developed the technique that we don't have, right? It's interesting, right? We saw the same with Maimonides, having to go outside, learn from Aristotle, and then more deeply understand his own tradition. Simone Weil is doing something similar, right? She's going to Eastern thought, and really, for her, the philosophical concepts there are fundamental for her to be able to fully live her Christian experience, right? So that's what she's doing. So she says we need to learn to act without acting. We need to learn the art of passive activity. And once we have mastered this, we will be better aligned, right? So we'll talk about this tomorrow also. Okay. Any questions? It's not that, there's nothing difficult. So any questions so far about Simone Weil? Okay.